You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
When we began to look at the whole question of Yibum, we learned the verses in Deuteronomy, in Devarim. And we said, Ki yeshvu echim yachtav, when brothers dwell together, umeit achad mehem uven ein lo, and one of them dies childless, lo tieh eshet hamet achutza liisha, the wife of the dead shall not be married unto somebody, some stranger, but Yevamot yavo aleha, her husband's brother, her yavam shall yavo aleha, and it's yavo. It literally means to go in unto her. Yavo aleha ulkacha lo leisha, and will go into her and will take her to him to wife. And this expression yavo, to go in, is a euphemism. It's actually a euphemism in Hebrew just as much as it is a euphemism in English. And it's actually a euphemism for sex. Yavo, to go in, means sex in Tanakh, and it's meant to mean that in English. And this euphemism is going to be picked up in the beginning of the 6th chapter of Yevamot. In fact, I would say the whole of the 6th chapter of Yevamot is actually related to sex. And we'll see now in the Mishnah, using the same euphemism, haba el yevimto, someone who goes into his Yevamah, someone who has intercourse with his Yevamah. And now we'll have a whole list of situations, bein shogeg, bein mezid, whether in error or deliberately. How this can be an error, we don't quite understand that. Maybe, and some of the commentators say, he doesn't have the intention to create yibum, to create levirate marriage. So this is some kind of, I guess it's a reference to licentious sex, maybe. It's difficult to understand really how the Mishnah can say bein shogeg, bein mezid, whether in error or deliberately. We don't quite understand how it can be an error, but let's keep going reading the Mishnah. Bein ba'ones, bein b'ratzon, whether under compulsion or whether under free will. Afilu hu shogeg v'hi mezida, maybe he is acting in error and she's intending. Hu mezid v'hi shogeged, or maybe he's intending and she's in error. So it sounds as though one party might be deceiving the other, and this statement is gender neutral. We're not sure who's deceiving who. Hu anos v'hi lo anusa, maybe he is under compulsion and she is not. Or maybe he anusa v'hu lo anus, maybe she's under compulsion and he is not. There are all these situations. And the Mishnah concludes, Echad hamareve echad gomer kana, whether he just began to have intercourse, or whether he completed having intercourse, doesn't make any difference. He's acquired her as a wife. And the Mishnah is articulating a principle that we've already spoken about before, but we haven't articulated it clearly. And maybe this Mishnah should come much higher up in the Masechet of Yevamot. It's not quite clear to me why this isn't coming higher up in the Masechet of Yevamot, because it's a fundamental principle. Maybe not because we're following a timeline. So we began with the death of the brother, and then we go on to possible promises and betrothal, and now we're getting onto the act of Yibum itself. Maybe we're following a timeline rather than following the principles. But the principle that the Mishnah is articulating is that Yibum, i.e. levirate marriage, is only really sealed when the marriage is consummated. And it doesn't seem to matter how the marriage is consummated, but it's sealed at that point. So, as we said before, the rabbis, they're not very comfortable with this. So the rabbis demand that we do a betrothal, either with a document or with money, before consummating the marriage. But in principle, the basic halacha, according to the Mishnah, and this is essentially reflecting the Pesukim. Yevamot yavo aleha, her brother-in-law shall come in unto her. The basic halacha is that the levirate marriage is sealed when the marriage is consummated. And then the Mishnah concludes, Velo chalak bein bia levia, and there's no distinction between different kinds of intercourse. And this seems to refer actually to anal sex. And we normally don't talk about anal sex in polite company, certainly not. It's not the sort of thing you discuss on the Shabbat table. But one of the things about the Mishnah is that the Mishnah is actually not embarrassed about talking about anything. So the Mishnah has a peculiar ability to address very calmly and very objectively all kinds of things that we personally find difficult. And so it does here. There's no distinction between different kinds of intercourse. They're all equal as far as cementing the yibum is concerned. And once we've got on to the question of what sort of intercourse is required to cement the yibum, we go on to talk about different kinds of intercourse and forbidden relationships. Because, as we've said before, what the tractate of Yevamot, what we're doing here in Yevamot is not just defining yibum, defining levirate marriage, but we're defining marriage in general. And so the Mishnah is going to take the opportunity to, once it's begun the question of sex, to define different kinds of relationships. So the Mishnah continues, and similarly, if someone has intercourse with any of the forbidden relationships in the Torah. So we begun by talking about a relationship which is commanded by the Torah. The brother-in-law is commanded to raise a son for his deceased childless brother. And we said, as far as that command is concerned, any kind of intercourse works. And by the way, when we get to the end of the sixth chapter, as we said, the sixth chapter is really focused on sex. When we get to the end of the sixth chapter, we're going to be talking about procreation and the mitzvah of procreation. Because everybody, or certainly everybody's commanded to have children. It's the first mitzvah in the Torah, Peru Ravu, be fruitful and multiply. And so there's this sixth chapter of Yevamot begins with a command to procreate on behalf of a deceased brother, and it ends with a command which is incumbent on essentially everybody. And in the middle, between these two commands, is going to deal with forbidden relationships. So it says, so if someone has intercourse with any of the forbidden relationships listed in the Torah, so for example, with your wife's sister, or with your wife's mother, for example, or psulot, or with any of those which are disqualified. So there are some relationships which are, if you like, not forbidden as incestuous relationship, but they're nevertheless against the law. What are these? Well, we're going to have a list now. Almanah Kohen Gadol. A widow can't marry a high priest. Grusha b'chalutza Kohen Ediot. A divorced woman or a chalutza, someone who's carried out chalitza, to an ordinary Kohen. Mamzeret unutina Israel, someone who's a mamzeret, or a netina, someone who's a Gibeonite, to an Israelite. This is a list of forbidden relationships which we've seen before actually in the Masechet. But Yisrael la mamzer, or a Jewish girl to a mamzer or to a Gibeonite. And if someone who carries out any of these relationships, the Mishnah rules pasal, makes invalid. If anyone has intercourse with any of these forbidden relationships, or when any of these other relationships, and here's the long list we've gone through, what's the ruling of the Mishnah? Pasal, makes invalid. What are we talking about when we say make invalid? The Mishnah seems to be saying makes her invalid from marrying a priest. A priest can't marry someone who's had a forbidden relationship. So if a man has a forbidden relationship with a woman, she becomes disqualified from marrying a priest. It's very interesting. He doesn't seem to be disqualified, but she's disqualified. And then the Mishnah continues with exactly the same close as we saw previously. In the previous Mishnah closed, Velo chalak bein bia levia. There's no difference between different kinds of intercourse. In the second Mishnah, we can see we're in a sort of poetic frame of mind here, closing in exactly the same way. Velo chalak bein bia levia. Doesn't matter what kind of intercourse, any of these kinds of intercourse disqualify a woman from marrying a priest. And then following this theme, we're going to learn a halacha about the daughter of a priest. And for this, we need a couple of verses from Vayikra, from Leviticus, from the Parsha of Emor, which explain, Uvat Kohen kitiel ish zar, a priest's daughter, if she's married to a common man, hibi trumat kodashim lo tochel, she can't eat truma. A priest's daughter will eat truma as long as she's in the priest's family. But once she marries an ordinary guy, she can't eat truma anymore. And if the situation reverses, she can go back to her father's house. Uvat kohen kitiel almana grusha, if the priest's daughter be a widow or a divorced person, vezera ein la, with no child, the kind of situation we're thinking about in our masachet, in our tractate. Veshava al beit aviha, and she comes back to her father's house. Kinoreha milechem aviha tuchel, she can eat of her father's bread just as in her youth. So in other words, when the daughter of a Kohen leaves her father's house, she stops eating truma, and if she comes back childless, she can start eating truma again. And the Mishnah will say, Almana la Kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza la Kohen edyot, a widow married to a high priest, or a divorced woman or a chalutza to an ordinary priest. These are the forbidden relationships that we've just learned about. Min ha'erusin lo yochlu bitruma. From the time that she's betrothed, she can't eat truma. So if this widow married to a high priest was the daughter of a Kohen, she's back in her father's house. But as soon as she becomes betrothed to a high priest, as soon as she becomes betrothed in a forbidden relationship, she can't eat truma anymore. As soon as the betrothal takes place. And Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon are going to disagree. Rabbi Elazar or Rabbi Shimon machshiren. Rabbi Elazar is going to, apologies for the translation on the source sheet, it's Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon are going to allow her. And everybody's going to agree, nit alma or nit garsha min hanisuin, if they became widows or were divorced after the marriage took place. So in other words, they become engaged, they become married, and then they become widowed or divorced. Pesulot, they're no longer eligible to eat truma. Umina erusin ksherot, if after betrothal, then they can still eat truma in their father's house. As if to say, going back to the theme of the tractate, which is essentially about sex, about intercourse, as if it's to say, look, it's the act of consummating the marriage which makes someone ineligible to eat truma. It's not the act of betrothal.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.